And I'm oh, got it. Yeah, I'm Hamish Osborne, and I'll be chairing this event this afternoon. I work for Natural Resources Wales, and I'm the environment team leader for Swansea. So I look after a team involved in conservation management and water quality issues in Swansea. And as part of my role, I'm also the chair of the Swansea RDP Local Action Group, the LAG. And we have a lot of common land in Swansea, as you probably all know. I'm involved in common land through my role as a in Natural Resources Wales, and also because I live in the middle of Gower and I have some personal interests in the management of common land here. And through my role in the LAG, I got involved in this project, and because we were the lead LAG in the corporation, leading a corporation project across South Wales. So welcome everybody. We've got an agenda running through, so there'll be various different presentations and some opportunity for some questions and discussion. So the project's objectives have been to develop a results-based approach to supporting the sustainable management of common land. This is not quite the final event, but the main final event in this 13-month project. Now, obviously, the project's been going 13 months, or will have been going 13 months, but it was several more actual years in the making. So this has been a long time coming, but I think it's come at a really, really important time, and we'll hear a bit more about that soon. There have been 4 technical seminars every Monday night. 3 have already happened, and can be viewed on the EFNCP website, YouTube channel. The last one is next Monday, so if you want to watch it live and you haven't got a link, get in touch with Gwyn. This event has also been recorded and will be available on YouTube within the next couple of days. So the aim of today isn't to go through the minutiae of the work. You can hear that in the technical webinars and in the final report. Rather, it's to hear some voices with the project. It's something which Grays and other stakeholders think could be a useful tool, which deserves further development. So we'll hear from Gwyn, who will give us a brief rundown of the project so far. Well, so far to where we've got to. A number of stakeholders or grazers from the project and some other stakeholders. There'll be opportunity for some questions and a bit of a discussion at the end. But if you have some questions or clarification during any of the segments, put them in the chat and we'll try and respond at the end of each bit. So we're going to start off with Gwyn. I guess many of you will have heard Gwyn's presentation before, presented on these issues before, but he's going to give us a bit of an overview to see where we've got to. So Gwyn, are you ready?
I am. Thanks, Hamish.
Over to Gwyn.
Okay. Everybody can see that, I hope. Is that okay, Hamish? I'll take it as it is.
Yeah, we can see that. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm just going to run through a summary of the project. As Hamish said, it's not the intention today to go into all the gory details. We try to do some of that in the technical webinars. So the project's been run by a small team, all of us working part-time, so I'll come back to them at the end, but I thought I should put their names up here just for now, so that it's on record. So to start at the start, the inspiration for the project came from a Welsh Government consultation paper, Brexit in Our Land, released a few years ago now. And in that, they said that the Welsh Government want to establish a new and flexible public goods scheme, which will enable land managers to be paid for the production of outcomes for which there's no market, for public goods, in other words. So that's quite a ambitious objective that they have. It's particularly ambitious, of course, because it would be the first time that all the agriculture support would have come through this mechanism. There are examples in other places in Europe where part of support comes this way, but not all support. So that's a particular challenge in general. But we know also that commons present challenges of their own, whether it's a results-based approach or a traditional action-based approach. This unique place where people have rights that overlap with each other as graziers and with each other and the owner of the soil. That's something that's very different in commons to other places, and we know in the past that that's been a problem. Glassdale Commons had difficulties at the start, and it led to the creation of the Commons Development Officers team. But it's a general thing. It's not just to do with Glassdale. You see it across the UK. You see it across Europe, actually, that commons are a difficult issue, but rather than being treated first because they're difficult, they get treated last, and often the solutions don't fit them very well. So we thought we should stick our oar in, maybe is the word, ask for funding to do some thinking. At that time, we didn't know what Welsh Government's plans were, what mechanisms, whether they were going to have pilots or trials or whatever. But we know from other countries what some of the issues are, and we thought we had something to offer to the discussion. And so we put in for funding, and we got funding, as Hamish said, from LEADER and from NRW themselves. So it's important at the start, I think, to recognise that commons are actually very important for the delivery of public goods in the project area, of course, but also wider in Wales. So the thing that people think about, first of all, maybe is biodiversity. So the common land in this area is all semi-natural habitats, extensively managed. And a lot of these semi-natural habitats are priorities, so priorities that are listed in the Environment Act, and priorities previous to that were in the Habitats Directive. And they support a large number of species, some of which also are priorities. And we know that these semi-natural habitats actually are important repositories of other public goods. And maybe prime amongst those is carbon. So these are undisturbed soils in these areas and commons, and not just peatlands, but other soils have huge stores of carbon, in fact. And so the defending of those stores is really important, and there's sometimes also opportunities to sequester more, in particular through the safeguarding of peatlands and other wet organic soils. The project area has open land, and most of the open land is common. And that makes them of great importance for public recreation, public health, access, enjoyment, tourism. The areas we're concerned with in South Wales are usually deprived areas. They have a higher than average health issues, mental health issues, as well as physical. And the countryside is increasingly seen as being a part of the solution to that, and the enjoyment of the countryside and the safe enjoyment of it. And commons make up a large amount of the resource that's available. So in some of these most deprived communities, over 80%, sometimes over 90% of the open access land, for example, is common land. But also within the patch, there's commons which are important as part of the tourist economy. They're part of what attracts people to the area. So whether it's Pen y Fan on the one side or the commons of Gower on the other, they're an important part of the economy of Wales beyond the farm itself. They also provide a lot of our public water supplies. in South Wales especially, lots of Welsh water catchments are on common land actually. And wider, they are an important part of regulating water flows. In other words, making sure that floods are attenuated and that base flows are maintained. Commons as a semi-natural habitat that covers a large part of the landscape, also very important in fire risk management. We'll hear later on from NRW about some of the issues that arise directly to life and limb in South Wales as a result of wildfire, but also the fire risk links to these other public goods, carbon stores, habitats, water quality, and so on. And the management of commons is an integral part of lowering that fire risk or managing that fire risk. And then, of course, there's a whole load of other public goods which we don't have time to list here. So biosecurity and animal health, the protection of archaeological and historical remains, and so on. So there's a lot of public goods to be addressed. And in the first technical webinar, we went through how we conceived of those, how we thought that policy described those, and how they could be synthesized into a single coherent picture. The challenges are great though. So this is an example of one of those challenges, which is this multiplicity of stakeholders and the fact that there's a lot of different types of stakeholders, even within the grazing community or the rights holders community. So this is some data that, well, it's got various sources, but the local data was collected by Sean Brackenbury some years ago. And it's of 31 commons in Gower. And it shows the contrast really between the number of people who have rights to graze in blue and the number of people who actually claim basic payment in red. And then finally, the tiny number that's actually doing the active grazing and the management of the commons in the green. And so one of the challenges for any payment mechanism, and especially a results-based payment mechanism which wants to encourage positive activity, is how to give this signal that the money should go to the people who are doing the job, who are incurring the costs, and who are delivering the outcomes, of course. So Welsh Government is very keen to say that it wants to make a difference, that's part of this results-based approach, this outcomes focus that it has, is that it wants to make a difference. And of course, that, I would say, means not only causing a change. In some cases, it will mean causing a change on the ground and in management, but in other places, it might mean making the production of environmental goods and the management that goes with it, making it more of a focus of management. That's also a difference in the way things work. And there's a number of challenges, of course, that arise, some of them more on commons than others, but some of them more general. So if we're interested in outcomes, how do we adapt what we're doing? How do we adapt how the scheme works to keep it focused on those outcomes? One of the difficulties with Glastir is that things were set at the start, and even if the outcomes weren't good, there wasn't really a feedback mechanism or a way to change things. Things were rather set in stone. Well, we don't want that if we want a results-based approach. The state obviously has to give some direction. After all, the issue is how to deliver the state's objectives, if we're honest about it. But how does the state best do that? In the past, it's done it by giving a set of rules. But I think that the grazier's skills and the grazier's experience and the ability of the grazier to incorporate the decisions into the business as a whole, that's a really important thing to try and incorporate, we would say. I showed you in that graph from Gower how split the rights holders are between the vast majority who do nothing and the small number who do everything. Well, it's very important to encourage the ones that are doing things, but on the other hand, we don't want to create a status quo what can we say, a clique, a cartel that excludes people who want to come in anew. And that's really very important. We want to encourage more people to be active if possible. There's a question also, of course, of how to share risk. So in the past, there's been different types of risk shared in different ways, but the results-based approach potentially has different types of risk shared in potentially new ways. So does the government wants to give a carrot to graziers, or to show a stick to graziers, but those carrots and those sticks need to be fair. They need to be things that graziers can respond to. There's no point showing a carrot that the graziers can't respond to. So that kind of thing has to be thought about. And then lastly, just for now, how to give support for good governance. So the best commons work by the graziers running their own affairs in an open and fair and, in a way that doesn't create this cartel, as we said. And government obviously has an interest in how that works, because we're talking about public goods here after all. We're talking about policy objectives. But how does it do that in a way that doesn't dictate everything? There's lots of ways to kill this particular cat, and different commons are doing it very different ways. So how does government encourage that without saying, well, this is the only way it can be? So the project doesn't start from nothing. The project starts from the experience of places like Ireland. And in Ireland, we see a model in which the results-based area payments are one part of a toolbox. And indeed, we would say, I think, that it can't work unless it's part of a toolbox. That's also an experience from Ireland. And so while we're focused on the results-based scorecard and the payments that go along with it, because that's the thing that's least known about in Wales, that's least tested in Wales, we also think that it needs other complementary support to go with it, essential complementary support in many cases. So some of the public goods objectives are quite tricky. Harv will talk later about fire management, fire risk management, but there's other things which also need a similar detailed planning approach, whether it's biosecurity and animal health on the one hand, or peat and restoration on the other. There's definitely a need for a complementary range of action-based payments. So we'll call them capital works, but it doesn't have to be fencing. It could be mowing of heathland, or it could be even controlled fires. I mean, that's all these things are possible, but that's definitely needed. Something that supports the delivery of those outcomes. And thirdly, of course, there needs to be a lot of support for advice, training, and appropriate equipment. And all of that, this is the way it works in Ireland, and it seems to be the only way it can work properly, is to have a small and dedicated support team, a project team that helps deliver it all. So just to go through the items quickly, the results-based scorecard, it was developed on the back of a 20-year tradition in Ireland of scorecards, so the Bowen, and then afterwards in the RBAPS project. And some of the development work on top of that was done in Scotland. I was partly involved in that. And it works by a 20-point scale, 0 to 10 in halves. That's the way we're doing it anyway. And the cards reward some positive things and has some negatives that take scores away if they're not appropriate. So the positive points are for species presence and species diversity, species frequency. First of all of herbs, we can say, and then in some circumstances also of heathlands. And then it also gives points for structure. This is one that the grazier has more control over, actually, so there's quite a lot of points on the structure side. And then when appropriate, it also rewards the presence of trees or of trees spreading, not in all cases, but in the right place. And then the negatives are for the things you might expect, so exotic species and invasives, certain types of vegetation that are expanding at the expense of other things. So it could be bracken, it could be European gorse, for example. Artificial drainage, especially where it impacts habitats, and then other damaging activities that are linked to the graziers management. So obviously we don't think it's fair that the graziers are held responsible for antisocial activity by other people, and how that's managed is a big topic, but it's one out with the scope of our project, and it should be out with the scope of the payments, I think. So the cards look something like this. Those of you familiar with the Irish and Scottish work will have seen it before. And so there's a number of sheets of it, and it's maybe a bit confusing when you first see it. And so for that reason, we were fortunate to have the services of David Jones, who did an app to demonstrate how it could work on a mobile phone for us. It's not all singing, all dancing. The projects that are truly rolled out in Ireland, they develop their own with links to bespoke programs. But it does illustrate quite well how it can be done very simply. And I think it's been quite well received. I confess to being a dumb phone man myself. So just to give an example of the kind of benefits that the cards can bring. So this is a common town in Southeast Wales. And as you can see, if I can remember how to do this, control that, yes. So this area, for the sake of argument, contains scores of 4. Maybe it's not all scores of 4, but let's say it's all scores of 4. So there's a range of structures there. And what we found when we scored this area here is that it was getting a lower score. And the reason was, it was quite an interesting reason, actually. So it was because the graziers had a message about conservation, which was kind of half-baked. They weren't getting the full story. So they'd got the message that they needed to do some mowing to create more diversity in the heathland. So this heathland was said to be almost triple SI quality when the biological survey was done. And they've been doing mowing, but they hadn't really got the message that the mowing should be in quite small areas. And so this area here, they had mown it quite short. And so they were losing points from the structure, from the card for that. Whereas this next area was one that they had yet to mow. And this was all quite rank, actually. So they were losing points for that. And then next to it, there was another area that was superficially quite similar to this area here. But the difference was that it had a lot of Sitka seedlings come from the forestry plantation here, courtesy of NRW, I think. So the Sitka was and is encroaching on this near SSI heath. And so the card says to them, well, okay, look, if you can address the mowing that you've done in that parcel and get it more structured, then you can increase to a score of 4. And if you do some mowing here, but in a more moderate way, then you can increase that also to a score of 4. And if you do mowing and get rid of the Sitka there, you can increase from a 0 also to a 4. And so actually you'll hear the graziers mention this in the video that's coming up next. It's a more subtle message than Glacier is giving them. And it's one that they can choose whether they respond to it or not, actually. So even in the absence of capital works, it may be that it's well worth them addressing the Sitka because there would potentially be a large amount of money available year after year if they did so. So this is the kind of engagement with issues and the kind of business thinking about it that the results-based approach potentially encourages. So alongside that, and of course a key part of the business approach is a payment rationale and payment calculations that lead to appropriately sized payments. Again, this has been a subject of a seminar, so we had that in the second one. So we rejected the income forgone model. We don't think it's appropriate, and we don't think it's realistic for reasons that we went into on the night. And what we've found is additional costs, which are also something that the World Trade Organization rules allow, which are realistic, we think, and which reflect the true costs of the people who are active and who are delivering. So these payments take into account the baseline of hill farming, because remember, we're not talking about having basic payment in the future, but also the additional costs of farming for conservation, and in particular, maybe the cost of having cattle, not just on a hill farm, but out on the mountain. So you can hear more about that if you tune into the second webinar. And then lastly, what I'm going to talk about next week in the webinar is that it implies a completely new process. This is perhaps the most, the last thing that people realize about it. This is the last thing that I've realized about it, I think is fair to say. So in the traditional Glassdoor approach, you sort things out at the start, you see what the rules are, of course, and whether it's worth it. And then you work out who will get the money, what the rules will be for getting the money for the next 5 years. And then you sign the contract for 5 years. And from then on, you hopefully just follow the rules and you hope that everything goes okay. And there might be some monitoring. You might never see a monitor, but there might be a monitoring. And every now and again, there'll be some opportunity for government to change the rules, but experience has been that it never seems to be the right time. So the monitoring results come in after you've redesigned the scheme, this kind of thing. So one example would be the grazing dates for mountains. Everybody you meet, everybody says that the 6 months that they chose isn't the sensible 6 months. But obviously people have been saying that for years, and the 6 months are still the same 6 months. So Glassdoor and the traditional approach is really very inflexible, but it's also something that demands a 5-year commitment, which is something quite difficult on common land, where obviously you'd have to be binding your successors. But the results-based approach is potentially completely different. So obviously on a common, not on a farm, all you need to say is, I'm interested in it, let's carry on. But on a common, there is some work at the start necessary. Of course there is. Not just the usual considerations of what does it involve, is it worth it, but also you need to think about principles for how to allocate money. But having done that, there's really no inherent need in the scheme to have any commitment. Obviously the government needs to offer you some commitment, otherwise why would you bother? But from the point of view of the graziers, there's no real need for a commitment, because every year you score the common at the end of the year. Every year you divide the money, and then you think, well, do I want to do this again? And if I do want to do it again, should we change anything? Should we try a bit of mowing here? Should we try a bit of cattle collars there? Whatever it is, that's just something you decide every year, which is a really completely different approach. And it's something that's much more, of course, engaging to the graziers. So it's challenging to the graziers on the one side, but potentially it's empowering to them also, actually. So, okay, there may be new entrants, there may be retirements, and there may be deaths, of course, but the principles are already agreed. And so the new people, they just fit into the same rules as before. And every year, there's potentially new people that are dealt with. Unlike the traditional approach, of course, there's an element of monitoring integral to every participant now. So every participant has a number of scores out in the field that can be monitored over time, and that will tell you how things are changing. Completely different, and that's made even more easy, of course, if there's IT involved and electronics recording. Of course, there might be needs for changes. That's obvious from the government side. So maybe people aren't responding to a signal, so there needs to be more money, for example, or maybe there's unintended consequences of some of the ways people are responding. But in general, the adjustments are in the grazier's hands. It's up to the graziers completely how they want to respond or not respond. And so that's a potentially very, very different approach. The project said that we would work through a number of example commons. We couldn't work everywhere. And so we had 2 commons in each local action group area. And we tried to select ones that had a variety of geographical, botanical conditions, but also grazier, what can we say, social conditions. So some of the commons obviously were coastal or lowland in the case of Fairwood and Llyntyrsant. We had lots that were in the sort of middle range of the uplands, and then some with the high ground and going up there to the top of the beacons. Some of the commons, Rhydri, for example, had a period where nobody was using it. It's just being put back into management now. And Graig and Leishon also has low levels of management. So a whole range of circumstances and conditions. And these are the places where we've been testing and developing the methodology, and also testing the concept with graziers, trying to get their feel for what they think, whether it's a runner, whether it's something that's worth pursuing, whether it's something that's too scary, or whether it's something that they feel with help that they can achieve. So we started with a quote from Welsh Government, and we can end in the same place, I think. So this is 4 years on, 3 years on, whatever it is. It's just the last couple of weeks. And so the Welsh Government brought out the way forward for the agriculture reform. And in that, they have a more focused, maybe, couple of paragraphs on common land. So they're not talking about commons councils anymore. They're saying, well, look, we think common land is really important. It should receive greater attention, consideration. And we want our proposals to work for common land, to be appropriate to common land. That's what they're saying. But having said that, it's quite clear that they have very few ideas available to work on. And so we end the project thinking that, well, the gap was there, the gap remains there, and what we've developed is a potentially valuable contribution to that discussion. Okay, thanks, Hamish.
Thank you very much, Gwyn. As always, a really clear and interesting presentation there on what the project was about and how it's developed and what it's up to. And you'll notice that Gwyn emphasising there the role of the grazers, of the commoners, and how we would like to transfer a lot of the decision making and a lot of the emphasis onto the active graziers. And I think now, Gwyn, we're going to hear some voices for some graziers, both in a video and in a bit of a discussion. So I think we've got a 15-minute video.
That's right, Hamish. Yeah, we've got a video first, and then after the video, we'll have a chat with a couple of graziers we've got with us. So I'll just share my screen now.
Okay.
Okay, screen. You see that, yeah?
Yeah.
You've seen the project we've been working on, the kind of things we're proposing, and you can compare it in your minds to Gloucester. So, I mean, do you think there's some mileage in this kind of approach? Is it something that you think Welsh Government would fruitfully look at when they're thinking about the next programming period? Do you think it's got some legs? Do you think it has mileage? Is it worth looking at?
Definitely. I was really pleased when it came along with this scheme, because we knew that the government schemes were coming to an end, or at least they've been telling us they were going to come to an end. And as a farmer, I'm totally reliant on subsidies. We can't farm without some support of some kind. So when we came along with this idea, we were really pleased to look at it. And we have done, and we've been pleased with what we've seen up to now.
Yeah. Well, it seems a very simple system, doesn't it? The card scoring is very simple, something we could take on ourselves as commoners. it looks to me like it could be the sort of the first steps to us managing our own commons or the biodiversity on our own commons, because that's the way everything's going, isn't it? Environment and biodiversity. So I can see it a good thing, you know.
One of the things that struck me when we were discussing it is how the different points over the different parts of the common was giving you a much more nuanced, maybe detailed message than you were getting from Glasgow. I mean, is that something that is valuable, or do you think it's a burden actually going forward?
In some ways it might be a burden, but I think we will amend to it. I think last year quite often was quite rigid. You know, like we had to turn the sheep to the common on a certain date. If the weather was bad or whatever, we had to turn them out on the 1st of April, which we found ridiculous. As a farmer, it was ridiculous, really. And if we didn't do that, we were going to be penalised. And to be honest, we haven't mentioned penalties really with this new scheme, and we seem to live as farmers doing that. We always worry about the penalties, and the penalties have been quite severe.
So can you tell me, are you in Glasgow just now? And if not, why not?
Last year they imposed too many things in place, too many rules, because the common is run with a trust. We effectively set the rules for the common. So that to have an outside audience, putting rules in, for example, to get any money from it, we'd have to set up a grazing committee, which would have been in absolute conflict to the trust committee. Well, we could manage the common. So you see, there's no point having two committees to decide the same thing, and you could have either set in opposition to each other, because most of the trustees do not keep animals on the common.
I don't part your comment here. There's a triple side.
Yes.
So do you have a clear picture now in your head of what NRW want for the different bits of the triple side?
Not really, no. No, I haven't. No. Basically, you know, they don't want it burnt and that type of thing. We have done projects with them before where we've been cutting gorse and bracken. But they seem to have come to an end now. But part of making sure it's not burnt is we don't know a lot about it. You know, what's valuable there and what isn't valuable really.
And do you think the kind of card approach would help in that regard?
But yeah, I would have thought so. Yeah.
Well, here at the start, common is a triple side.
Yeah.
So would you say that you've got a good picture of what NRW are wanting on the common?
Yeah, to be honest, we have quite a good relationship with we meet really quite regularly. We've got a plan in place at the moment. So yeah, we have a good relationship.
And do you think that the kind of approach that we've tried to develop using these scorecards, do you think that will be help you in the understanding of what the authorities want for the common?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense, to be honest. So what you're suggesting is that we're looking at the biodiversity of the area, what plants are living in a given certain size. I mean, that makes sense to everybody. I don't know how else you can do it. If I'm truthful, it would be good to develop again scheme with natural resources, a management scheme.
And that payment is for certain management and capital management as well.
Essentially to manage the capital.
Okay, and how is that payment distributed?
Well, it's a new scheme at the moment. So what we want to do, that's going to be paid to the town trust. And what we'll do then, we'll pay that out to people who graze the common.
Okay.
For example, and if some people have to test that TB, we have money to pay for them tests.
Okay. So what you're saying is that with this NRW agreement now, you're putting in place a framework for paying people who are actually active.
Yeah.
And so if the payments that we brought forward, suggested, if they worked in the same way, you would have that mindset already in the town trust to do that. Is that what you're saying?
It has to be. There are so many factors that make it difficult to raise the common these days that the only way you're going to do it is help people as much as you can. You know, if you're a small producer like myself, only keeps a food capital and so on, then the costs increase to your decisions to put them on there.
What kind of things do you think we need to address before the thing's ready to roll or ready to test anyway?
Well, we mentioned talked a fair bit about scorecards and what have you. The only issue from my point of view is if there are payments associated with that, then who's going to get them? Because the common, most common from almost somebody else, trust farm is different. We own it. It's vested in the town trust, so we own it as well. So, and we get the present system. Some farms claim, or certainly add the common acreage to their claims for the single farm payments. We never praise the common. Anything to change that for us is a good thing, because we need grazers desperately.
I know the two of you, probably the only ones that I'll be speaking to that have done. You've been over to Ireland, you've been to Bowen. So what was your impressions there? What did you like that you saw there that you think could be built into or be a result of this kind of approach?
I was quite pleased when I went to Bowen because the farmers there seemed happy with the schemes they had. There are numerous schemes running there and running alongside each other, and they had this scorecard type system there. But they didn't seem to be under any pressure. The farmers were sort of saying, well, if you want to increase your score, well, you do this and that. But there was nothing forcing them to do that, and the farmers seemed to work with it very well. Yeah, and they were happy farmers. They were. I thought that type of scheme they had there worked quite well, and this is similar, I think.
But the level of support they had was very high. Although they may have been in the initial 5 or 6 years of the program, the support and backup that they received was tremendous, not just from the ministries, but from the universities and from the assessors and the people with the ideas, the environmental ideas that actually backed onto the farm. A tremendous network. We're starting off with 5 people, or 4 people, and with them they started off with 100 people, plus a full weight of the universities behind them. They had a tremendous backup.
You mentioned there, Les, the fact that in the Irish way of doing this, there's a project team which is giving support. What do you think? I mean, how much support would you need to do such a thing on your common? Would it be just at the start, or would you need it going forward? What do you reckon?
I think we need it for the first year. We would need to establish the balance between marking the cards, estimating our scores on the cards, and also learning the plants and the other things in the environment that we're supposed to be looking for. Because at the moment we're pretty dull at that, aren't we? And if you ask us what certain plants were, we're not botanists, some of us not even good gardeners. So it's, we want backup on that. And I would like to see, I'm not saying I'd like someone living on my shoulder, but I'd like a phone number to call.
I think we need ongoing support. We do. The farmers will adapt to that, and it's only doing things what we've been doing all along anyway, really. But when I say it's going to be a little bit different, identifying species of plants and stuff like that, and others and what have it. But we are doing it, and we are looking after it as it is now. But if we need to do that to join the scheme, I'm sure farmers will adapt. I will for sure.
The thing is, you have to change. We would have to change our approach a bit, because we're looking at areas now which, in some cases, have been ignored because we haven't had to get down them, like the feral trees, for instance. But if we came into this scheme and we sort of benefit cutting those feral trees down, our management program of the mountain would change, and we'd be looking at managing the mountain in line with the scheme. Rather than, anything else, that would take priority. And if it improved the scheme and improved the payment, then there would be more incentive for people to do it.
How much assistance do you think you need to get into the system? And then as the thing went along, every year, how much help do you think?
That's a good question, and I really don't know if it's the honest answer to it.
And do you feel that you'd be able to do the card? I mean, would you need training, do you think? Would you need support on an ongoing basis?
I think we need initial training, and then maybe somebody to come out, or somebody to be like an advisor that we could tap into it with problems as we go along. I think after initial training, we do most of it ourselves. I think, all right, it's not complicated. It's just knowing how to do that thing.
Do you think that there would be help needed for graziers to come together to an understanding between each other? You know what I mean? Is a neutral voice something that's of help?
Yes, I think so. Yes, yeah. We'd need that. We need something to bring everybody together. That was the main one. You just said then is having somebody to what's the word? You know, organise us perhaps. You know, and somebody that's watching over us then in a way. That would be the biggest thing, I think.
So just maybe to finish, if you had a message to give to your AM or to the Minister, to Welsh Government, what would it be?
I'd say we should go with it. We should go with it for two reasons. One is the first scheme that's come out that actually backed environment and habitat and supports it. And it also gives flexibility to the farmer in the way that he controls his stock. And I think those two things together would have great benefits for the economy.
What did you say, Howard?
Well, when I say this, we realise that it's public money that we're having in subsidy, and we're prepared to do something back for that. And we need to think that the public need to see what we are doing. And this scheme does all that. I think it brings up, you know, what we are doing is right for the environment, right for carbon retention and water management and all those sort of things. And I think we're prepared to go that way. I don't really think we just want subsidies just to sit in our farmers. We want to do something for it, which we are, but I think this scheme fits the bill. Pretty much the best scheme I've seen up to now. Perhaps the only one, perhaps you might say, I don't know, but it certainly worked. This type of thing worked in Ireland. It worked very well, and the farmers are happy. That's what I like. The farmers seem to work with it, which is good.
It definitely needs to be piloted, doesn't it? Because there doesn't seem to be anything else happening with the commons.
So the common is connected to the town in a way that's really much greater than in many other areas, actually, isn't it? Yeah. Do you think this is something that the inhabitants of the town can be really proud of in the future? Do you think it's going to be a real product they can boast about?
Absolutely. As you see, the building is part of belongs to the town trust. It's managed for the benefit of the local area, local people, but so is the common. I mean, only certain people have the right to graze. That's set out in our rules now. However, everybody uses the common to walk the dog on the Sunday or whatever else. On the meeting place, and we encourage that. And there is a huge movement now towards environmental issues. Everybody's aware. I mean, this last week the amount of rain we had is unusual. If you're not aware of global warming, then you're not living on the same planet as everybody else. So we need to be looking at what we can do to ease that. We've got plans in place. If we can't get people to graze, we will look to buy cattle ourselves as a trust. It's quite difficult, but it may be the way forward for us in the future, just to maintain what we have now, in order to fulfill, of course, our obligations to everybody as well. Maybe possible.
Obviously, results this year, they're not the whole picture. Do you think that could be an important tool in that?
Absolutely crucial. And I think agriculture in particular needs to work with nature as a symbiotic relationship. One can't survive without the other. And as far as we have to say that this is what we're doing, it's like this because of what we do.
Okay, that's it. I hope it came across okay. Can you hear me, Hamish? Yeah.
Sorry, yeah, I was on.
Fine. So I'd just like to thank Jeremy Herbert, who helped us make that video over a very short amount of time. So it's got some rough edges in it, but I thought it was really worth doing. We wanted to get some graziers involved in this final event, and we didn't really know how to do it with enough people, really. And the things they came out with, just off the top of their head, they weren't rehearsed. We didn't plant them there. I was really pleased with what they were saying. But we do have two graziers with us today. so they can introduce themselves, Stella Owen and Brian Bowen. So we'll start with you, Stella. Can we talk about the what we've done first and talk about policy later, if that's okay, the wider policy? So she's going to give us some reactions to what you've heard before and what you've seen today. I mean, do you think there's some mileage in the whole thing?
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. Yes, just so you know, we're grazing on the Brecon Beacons, including Buckland, where you've done quite a lot of work as well. You know, I think what I like is that for once, this type of approach in terms of the common land, the scorecard, is at the start of the debate. In the past, I think when we were looking at Glasssteer, it was very much on the catch-up on the common land side of it. What we're fortunate now is that the grazing associations are set, and I think historically, if you went back 10 years, some commons had not got that more formal grounding of chairman, secretary, and a constitution. So, you know, Glasssteer, you know, it did bring all of that to the fore, and there is far more formal arrangements now in terms of grazing association setups, which I would really like to see involved, you know, from the beginning here. Now, you know, if you were looking at, you know, our end, really, you know, we range from private landlords of commons, lords of the manor, to maybe national trust ownership. I do have some reservations, probably because the answer hasn't been given yet as to who owns these outcomes. And whilst, yes, as graziers, we hear a lot about it's our grazing rights, I need that reassurance that these will be contracts set with graziers, and that the graziers have control of that contract, whatever it may look like. And I would like to see some more flex within the contracts. I think the Glasssteer contracts have been very rigid, and time moves on. You know, we've certainly seen that with enclosed land, you know, whereby extensions are being given. People are in sort of year 7, 8, 9 now with some of these contracts, and yet still tied into options which they chose many years ago. Well, the farm changes, new land comes in, new graziers come on, you know, so I would like to see there to be a little bit more flexibility there to any contracts like this that may change. But the grazing associations are going to be absolutely key to this, and I really hope, you know, they're given that voice and that dialogue is given at an early stage.
Yes, I think your point about the who owns them is an interesting one, isn't it? I mean, as you may be aware, I mean, we tried to have our payment calculation based on the cost of, you know, real cost of real people then, you know, so if there's no cost, then there's no payment. But it is interesting to see some of the Welsh Government consultations, isn't it, where they're talking about moving away from the WTO rules, which, okay, I think everybody might think, you know, superficially has a great attraction to it, but the minute you do, then you go into exactly the kind of issues that you're talking about. Yeah, thank you. We'll come back to you now. Brian, you want to introduce yourself and give us a first reaction?
Well, I'm Brian Bowen, yeah, and I'm sort of vice chairman of the FUW, but farming on the southern part of the Brecon Beacons, above the heads of the valleys. You know, without the common land aspect to my farming enterprise, it would be, you know, non-existent really. It's nice to see that there's focus on a scheme which is, you know, simply about the common. If you know, the issues that I have is that we, while under BPS, the area of common was calculated, so the funding has to contribute to both the BPS value plus the Glasssteer package, which we've got it now, and that it shouldn't be just, you know, focusing on an environmental only. It has to be backed with the farming enterprise that's sort of going to feed the common in from our perspective. Yeah, I think there's mileage in it, because I think we have a value on the common, which I think we should tap into, and this is one form of doing it. Understanding some of the scorecards is going to be something that's going to be carried over a period of time, because myself, I'm quite green. I'm getting to that age where I don't pick up on things, but I'm sure if there's a few pound notes stuck against it, we'll adjust quite well, like Howard Ricky said. Some of the it's getting the funding to the active graziers, and we found through the Glassdeer scheme that people, I'll say armchair farmers then, who are not contributing to the common itself, is something that I'd like to sort of, I'm not saying, right holders may be something, but active graziers is going to be the issue which is going to be for the funding, because I think it's crucial now with the tighter funds that we get that one right. And the other thing is, I think there needs to be either a secretarial or management position to manage a slightly independent to farmers, I think, to be able to just have some sort of authority over, and be it that I don't want to put a negative in, but scheme rule breakers are something that need to be managed, and it's a little bit different when it's in-house to manage those things, because everybody sort of tends to sort of lean on money makers and forget about the rule breakers, and I just need sort of some form of authority, whether it is that goes to government or we have a constitution which will run the scheme presumably, but there needs to be some form of authority there to sort of I don't say I'm not looking at penalizing, but maybe in some cases it will need to be addressed then. Otherwise, everybody gets penalised, and I don't see that fair on the ones that are trying to do their best. And there are a lot of good people out there, but dealing with that would be one of my sort of concerns as well.
Yes, thanks, Brian. I think this point about BPS is a crucial one, really, isn't it? It's in some of the documentation, you get the impression that the only thing that needs to be paid for the environment is this change, doing that little additional bit more, as if everything else is making money no problem without any support at all. And of course the real picture is the exact opposite of that, if anything, isn't it? Can I go to you, Stella, and raise one of the things that Brian touched on there, which is this question of advice or a backstop, an independent backstop or whatever. I know we've talked about this before, but I know in some of the union submissions, there's been a big stress on the money needs to stay with the farmers. We don't want to be, having a license to print money for consultants or whatever. So can you just explain what the difference is between the common and the farm in your view?
Yeah, I think when you go back to Brexit and our land, there was an awful lot of emphasis on advice, create, enhance. There was very little respect, I think, within there, for farmers who are more than capable of carrying out Scorecard, who are more than capable of carrying out a lot of this administration on farm. I certainly would feel it a failure if I failed to score our farm or an area of common land, for example, and I would take that very hard. But I think the common land development officers were very, very integral to the success of the Glassdeer Common Land Scheme, the inception. It may be that you've got some commons that may sail through, some that are not as vast as others. There may be some that have not got as many graziers as others, and this is where the grazing associations will be key. There might be, quite a lot of responsibility for somebody to go out and score a common, so they might want a little bit of hand holding. There might be somebody that said, no, we can do it, it's fine. And there will be others that may need to have that hand holding throughout the duration of the contract. So again, I think that flexibility and that option should be there, but I wouldn't want to see this advice coming through on this scale, which is what we saw on Brexit and Our Land, and having to have this advisor in order to sign a contract. You know, I am a firm believer that farmers know the lie of the land better than anybody. And if then they feel they need a bit of advice, additional help and assistance, then that is there for them. You know, the farm liaison officers are outstanding. There is a trust there. The Common Land Development Officers, those CDOs, were really good, you know, at bringing people together and ironing out some of the concerns that were out there. Now, they were also key in saying, actually, we had that issue come up on another common. So you could compare commons and compare things as to how people managed to iron out, conflicts, for example. It might have been they were concerned about their rights post-Glastier, you know. So I think that was a really, really important part, and that go-to place for the Common Land Development Officer was really, really through to the successors scheme. And I am worried as well, you know, with this. I mean, Howard mentioned that the Irish are happy. Let's not forget, the Irish have still got a BPS. They are still under cap. This new scheme will be the BPS and the Glastier, that budget together. Now, that stability, that is the funding, what we need. So, you know, we're not looking at a separate BPS coming through. This is it, and I wouldn't want that to get forgotten along the way as well.
Yeah, that's right. And it's not just BPS, of course. They have an ENC scheme and the National Glastier scheme, and yeah. No, that's quite right. That's quite right. It's a tall order, really, what Welsh Government, the task Welsh Government has set themselves, I think. So just before I go back to Brian, so if you had like a couple of requests to Welsh Government now, where should this go next, do you think?
I think the phase what we're at next now will be who owns those outcomes, who is going to be responsible for those outcomes, who is going to be paid for those outcomes. You know, when you're looking at common land, it will be, you know, is it Lord of the Manor? Is it the Grazing Association? Is it the landlord? You know, we are seeing a very, very noisy environment at the moment in terms of tree planting, in terms of carbon trading. These things are moving very, very fast. And, you know, I think we do need those reassurances now as to who owns these outcomes and who will be responsible for delivering them. You know, I think we are at that point, you know, and this isn't solely on common land now. We've got tenants who are worried about where they stand with their rented land, whether it's on FBT, you know, whether it's on shorter term grazing. My lights have gone in from my office. And so, you know, we do need to have some of these reassurances coming down the line. We have, I mean, the common land works because the enclosed hill farms work, family farms, and those family farms work because they've got a really good common land structure. The two work in tandem, and I really, really want to see those communities doing well and prospering in the future. So we do need those reassurances. We have always said, you know, the financial money should go to those who are carrying out the business risk. This is why we sort of wanted this stability payment as an NFU, because we did see that, you know, if you want to go the next phase, environmental, then there's options to explore. But this all in one pot, you know, is very, very concerning, especially if you're tenanted, especially if you've got common land, where, you know, we do need to know who owns those outcomes, who will be responsible for them, and who will be paid for them.
Okay. Stella, thanks very much. Over to you, Brian, for the last one.
Well, you know, I mean, it's just reiterating basically what has just been said. To be honest, Gwyn, it is there needs to be assurances on the value of this fund then that's going to support the common land. It's a large area in Wales, isn't it? And you know, I mean, it's crucial to the topography of the landscape of Wales. You know, it has a cultural aspect to it as well, so it has to work, but it has to work with people who understand that the areas. It's just getting everybody to to understand what is expected of them. And, you know, I mean, I know the scorecards are there to show you, right, what you can get for what, but it's how you progress to get. Not everybody is going to be on an equal space, as we well know when we walk around the commons. There are totally different aspects, and it has to be valued to the point, not because I've got something better than you, that you should be penalized for not having it. If you're managing your patch, regardless of what you've got in a high valued manner, then you should be rewarded for it, because that's what we're aiming for. And, you know, the common is a big part of my life now, and I cover quite a few different graziers within my patch, and we need it there, but we have to tell members also that they have to participate to get a valued fund back. So, you know, I mean, it's not a case of sitting there and saying, where's my payment? It's a case of being involved in it as well. And, you know, that's what I want to see is funding going to the people that are involved. And yeah, and I don't want to exclude anybody, but I think we need assurances of, like Stella said, about who actually owns this entitlement and value of this fund, which is going to be paid out to graziers. You know, I mean, we need that as part of the farming practice. So, yeah.
Good, thank you, Brian. Just a reflection on one thing you said there about you know, this question of getting paid for what you do as opposed to getting paid for the outcome. This is one of the key questions, I think, when it comes to this risk sharing, really. You know, that if the points can't change quickly, and it requires a lot of work, then that calls for a different type of funding, I think, an action-based, you know, capital works type funding. And so that's something that government has to be really careful about, I think. You know, if it was to be developing this, you know, there's no point having a results-based approach if its result is heartbreaking. You know, yeah. It's got to be an encouragement, hasn't it? You know, it's got to be something that makes people want to get up in the morning and do more that day. You know, yeah. Okay, well, Brian and Stella, thanks very much indeed. Time is moving on, so we have to go to the next speaker. But yeah, that was really useful. Thanks very much indeed. I appreciate it. And the next speaker is actually John Ratcliffe from NRW. I forgot to ask you, John, do you have a presentation? Because I need to give you control if you're...
Yes, Gwyn, I do.
Okay.
I'll try and keep it brief. I think I can.
Fine. No, you don't need to keep it brief.
Oh, no. You need to enable
you can
me,
introduce yourself, John, when I've given you control.
Okay. Quick introduction, because I don't know many of the other people on the screens. I'm John Ratcliffe. I work for Natural Resources Wales. I've been in the business a little while. I'm a jobbing ecologist, for what it's worth. With a mottled history. I was introduced to the joy of peat and peat bogs by David Bellamy about 50 years ago. Some of you may remember him. And worked in the flow country. And even a period in Indonesia trying to grapple with the Indonesian Forestry Department, not one of my finest hours. And then more recently, well, for the last 30 odd years or so, I've been based in North Wales. Mostly in operations, dealing with a variety of commons, many of them on the coast, Sand Dune and Heathland Commons, and then more recently on the uplands, and are now been elevated to the lofty heights of science and policy advice across Wales, but mostly again, concentrating on the uplands. So I think I should be able to share my screen. If I can get the right screen up there. Is that coming through?
Not so far.
Give it a second. Is it coming through now?
Not yet.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe share the full, like all the screens first, and then choose the screen you want. Now
Something's happening.
Okay, bingo.
Yeah.
Okay, so I've thrown together some thoughts in 10 slides. I've told I've got 10 minutes, so let's power through them. Natural Resources Wales is a rather large and nebulous and many-headed organisation, but one of the things that it says constantly is sustainable management of natural resources, which is defined as using natural resources in a way and at a rate that maintains and enhances the resilience of ecosystems and the benefits they provide. In doing so, meeting the needs of present generations of people without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs, and contributing to the achievement of the well-being goals of the Well-being of Future Generations Act, I quote. Well, what does that really mean? On the grounds that nobody that I know would actually propose unsustainable management of natural resources, I'm not really sure that it gets us that far. So let's see if we can delve a bit deeper. It does sound a bit like motherhood and apple pie, or as Greta Thunberg said last week, blah, 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 because who wants anything else? So what do we actually want from our commons? Well, remember, we're got to view this in the context of the climate and nature emergencies. This is real stuff. It's not climate change in the future, it's climate change which is happening now. And of course, we also have an energy crisis, and this winter we're going to have a food crisis. And I think that if government is to offer any support, it has to be support in addressing all of these things. So we want everything. We want food, we want fiber, we want nature and biodiversity. We want everything, don't we? But change is on its way. Change is coming. Change has arrived on our doorstep. And the way in which we deliver these things is going to have to change. But we can't do everything everywhere all the time. So we do have to make some priorities and some choices as to which takes priority or which achieves a particular balance in a particular place at a particular time. And bear in mind that there are other options. With the loss of the basic payment scheme, the changes in agricultural support, we could see abandonment. We are seeing abandonment of some upland areas now. We're certainly seeing abandonment of many of the small commons that I used to deal with in the lowlands. We could see afforestation of much of the uplands, many of the areas of the Freeze, the interface between lowland and upland, I think, is going to be up for grabs for afforestation. You may remember in 2019 that all the political parties were vying with each other, playing beauty contests as to just how many trees they were going to plant. Some fairly interesting numbers were emerging. And out there in the wings is the rewilding movement. And it's not just the royal family in Prince Charles who are under pressure for the rewilding movement. Whether you're for it, against it, have reservations, wish to embrace it, rewilding is a thing out there. And I think it would be foolish to ignore it and not address it in some way, in a constructive way, because there are genuine people out there trying to do genuinely good things. Whether you agree with their methods or not, blocking motorways or whatever, is another matter. But it's something that we need to really be aware of. Or we can plan. We can take control of the situation and try and move that change in a direction which we decide for a variety and multiplicity of land uses. And I want to reveal that I don't really know many of the commons that you've been dealing with, Gwyn, in this particular project. I'm more familiar with stuff up here in the north. I'm a GOG, I'm afraid. So I just want to home in on Abercommon, Llanllech, cloak these northern slopes and run together really as one huge grazing area. Abercommon is a huge, I think it's about 2,000 hectares of common land going up to the mountain summit at 3,000 feet, 1,000 meters. And we've had a long-standing agreement with the graziers over much of this area, which I think is actually working quite well. And we started on the basis that we would draw up a vision of what we wanted to create there. And it wasn't the status quo. It was change. It was change to something a bit more wild and woolly, a bit more shaggy, a bit more heath. We've outlined areas where we really want the blanket bog to come back and be blanket bog, and not just acid grassland and squirrels, heathgrass and heath rush blanketing the ground, but actually have sphagnum bog in it again. And we've defined areas where we wish to maintain short grassland for the purposes of foraging chough, and areas that we want to convert to heathland. And in many areas, a sort of mosaic, a dynamic mosaic between those things. And this has been running, I think, for about 10 or 15 years now, and it's starting to produce change and constructive change. The bog habitat is improving. The heathland habitat is improving, even up on the summit where things move really, really slowly. Change is really slow because it's such an extreme climate up there. Even there, some of the montane heath has at least stopped declining and is beginning to show a few signs of life. If I can just point out some of these areas, some of you may know Coedwith Aber National Nature Reserve and the forestry plantation here. And the plan here is for a little bit of woodland expansion, or at least freeze expansion. I don't think we're there yet. I don't think that's really happening yet. That requires some tweaking and some further thought. But there you've got at least a vision. More recently, been working with graziers on Mynyddig to see if we can explore this concept of a future landscape, of a future vision for how we want the mountain to look. And this is a colourful map. I've not labelled it up because it's a sort of pre-production copy draft at the moment. But the purple is heath. The bright orange is calcareous grassland, lime-rich grassland. The stippled areas is mixtures of heath and grassland. And there are some suggestions here of areas where we could actually extend woodland and streamside plantings up these cloughs, up these narrow, deep valleys where sheep tend to get lost anyway, and actually fencing those out and having them as tree cover might be quite useful. But as I say, this is part of an ongoing conversation. It's been very interesting following this project, Gwyn, and seeing where your scorecards take us. But it leaves me with, and I think those scorecards have developed really nicely, despite our disagreements early on about the value or otherwise of star sedge. I think that what you've ended up with is actually really quite useful, very useful indeed. And it gives some people a more tangible thing to aim for. But I'm still left with the question of, if we're trying to use scorecards and scoring goals, what is the goal that we're trying to score into? Where is the goal? Is it SMNR, that rather nebulous, ill-defined, all things to all men, apple pie? Or is it some real, visible, measurable outcome, which a farmer, a grazier, a land manager can use their real skills to produce, just as they're producing sheep meat or beef or whatever. They are paid to produce a particular habitat, a particular outcome, which is then monitored and guided by your scorecards. So to my mind, we haven't quite got to the point, and I think we were almost getting to it in that discussion with Stella and Brian, of not just who owns the payments, but who owns the outcomes, who decides on the outcomes, who decides on the goals that we're going to aim for. I think that our conversation as conservationists, as ecologists, with land managers is always hampered by terminology. We talk as ecologists about bog and flush and fen and blanket bog and raised bog and kettlehole bogs and shringmoor and poor fen and rich fen. I could go on. Mires and bogs and wetlands are particularly full of terminology. But do we talk about heathland or moorland? And does a heathland have to have heather on it? And what's Kaluna? And who is Erica? And how do you define more dynamic habitats, particularly, as I was saying, dealing earlier with some of these coastal commons? How do you define dynamic habitats such as sand dunes, where actually change, and in this case erosion, is really the whole essence of the ecosystem? It's what drives the ecosystem, and if you stop change, then the ecosystem just declines and loses its inherent value. So we need to find a way of communicating. We need support and training in communication. Sorry, there's a little reference to that other terminology of improved pasture, which I always find begs the question of what an improvement on. I think we need to talk about how to make that dialogue with graziers, with land managers, flow better so that we understand each other better. I think we need support and training in doing that. And I think one of the points that NRW has made time and time again in our consultations with Welsh Government on the sustainable farming scheme is the need for that to be backed by really good project officers, ground officers, advisors who can talk constructively and regularly with land managers. But we need that communication, and I think that we actually need pictures. I know that in the scorecard you've used pictures in many cases of individual species to try and train people up to a botanical standard, but I think we need to put that together as well and talk about the structure of these habitats and what really makes these places tick, so that we convey an image of what it is we're trying to produce. And of course, before that, in terms of owning those outcomes, we need that dialogue with the land manager, with the graziers, and with the local experts who know the mountain, who know the common, to determine what it is that we really want to see in the future. Because in most cases, it's not necessarily going to be the status quo. It will be something different in a new climate, a new environment, a new political environment, as well as a new ecological environment. And remember, in all of this, it's really all very easy. And you've only got 24 different species of native rushes in the UK, so what could be easier? Thank you. That's me done.
Thank you, John. Gwyn, would you like to come back on some of John's points that he's made at the end?
Very well played there, Hamish. Well, one thing I would, I suppose, like to ask, I'm getting the impression, John, from what you said there and from discussions we've had before, that you do see some value in the approach, and you're tentative about it, but you do think there's a way forward, and you do think there's a potential use for NRW as the competent authority in some of these issues, and potentially for Welsh Government. But what do you think should be the next step then? How could this be taken forward?
Gwyn, I'm not tentative about it. I think the scorecard approach is really useful, really constructive. It's clearly the way in which we need to go to get farmers and graziers and land managers more engaged in understanding what it is they're trying to produce for the public, and giving them a tool to kind of travel that path and adjust their management accordingly. But I think that it begs the question, which we should have done a long time ago, or answered a long time ago, what it is we want to produce in the first place. So if you've got a scorecard for heathland, where do you want that heathland in the first place? If you've got a scorecard for marshy grassland, where do you want that marshy grassland? I mean, marshy grassland maybe is not such a good example because it tends to determine its own location by the hydrology. But in many instances, we can envisage changing a habitat, changing the present, either overgrazed or undergrazed or mismanaged habitat to something else. And there is a decision process to go through to determine what it is that we want there. And that, I think, is untrodden ground in many areas. There's an assumption that the status quo and a minor modification of that is the be all and end all, and I'm not sure that that is any more the case.
Yeah, I think one of our early misunderstandings or talking past each other was when you realized that I wasn't talking about features, and when I realized that features were something that everybody expects me to be talking about. So that was an interesting discussion at the start, wasn't it? And the stress that you always put when we were talking about direction of travel, certainly with this intentionality that you're talking about, that you need to know what the endpoint is, but that the moving along the pathway is in itself a valuable thing, that it's not just valuable when you get there. I appreciated that in our discussion.
Yeah, there's also going to be a range of different answers to what we're trying to achieve. One of the main things we've been trying to do is work out a method, a way of achieving a shared understanding of what good looks like. But first of all, you might have some decisions to make about what sort of good you want, as you say. And I don't know whether that's a step before or beyond, to some extent, what we have been trying to do in this project. Is that right, Gwyn, would you say? Because we can have some commons where it will be immediately obvious what we're trying to achieve, and others where it'll be up for debate. Who has that debate? Who is in charge of that process? It maybe is a separate question.
Yes, I think one of the difficulties that we had earlier on was trying to determine what we thought Welsh Government, and that includes NRW obviously, what their vision was for different habitats and places and features and whatever. And that was really difficult. And it seems very, very strange after, well, how long ago is 1984 or 1994, 20, 30 years, for that not to be something you can find out quite clearly. So John was very helpful in that regard. But lots of this isn't official, really. So we tried to develop a scorecard which we thought reflected the kind of changes that were needed and the kind of ideal endpoints that were needed. But we may have got that wrong. We didn't take into account a lot of the ecosystem services, which aren't public goods, obviously. But largely, we felt, with the exception of growing Sitka, I think, that these were compatible. Actually, we didn't come across many extreme conflicts where things couldn't be accommodated. We didn't feel, but John might feel different about that.
I don't think I didn't detect extreme conflicts, but I think there were still nudges to be made as to what we wanted to see and where we wanted to see it. So as I say, I think that there is still a conversation to be had on each of these commons, on each of these mountains, as to what the potential of the land is, given the changing climate and the changing demands of the market and of the political environment that we live in. And that's where I think we're still a step away from nirvana, from a solution to this. I mean, I don't think that it's a single, well, it's not a single step in the sense that it will be an ongoing conversation and it'll be a moving feast as the future develops. But we need to be brave enough to embrace the idea of change. I know change is often seen as being a negative thing and a scary thing, but actually it is what we and our children, our grandchildren are going to have to live with. Changing climate is a new factor which has never been factored in before, but it is very real.
Okay, thank you, John. I think there's a lot to discuss there that we could go on, but I think
can I just interrupt and ask John to give me back the control, please? Make me the host. Sorry, Hamish.
So I think we'll leave it there for now, and we'll move on. And if I'm right now on the order of proceedings, we are going to talk about some of the issues with regard to managing some of the fire risk on the commons. And I think we're going to have you got a presentation, or are you just going?
I have got a presentation, so I don't know whether do I need to take control, or can I just share my screen from now? I think it's
you do need to take control, but NRW is loath to release it, obviously.
I'm not sure I've got the right controls here, Gwyn.
You click on participants and then click, well, now on Harv's name where it says more, and it gives you the option to make Harv the host.
So, Harv,
can you see?
Leave you to introduce yourself in a second.
Screen anyway. Yep.
Can you see my screen, everyone? Sorry.
I can.
Yes.
There we go. Oh, wonderful.
So
that's it then.
From Harv Leishon, if you want to introduce yourself, Harv, probably do a better job than me.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, my name's Harv Leishon. I'm here on behalf of the Healthy Hillsides project, which is a Welsh Government funded project working with the South Wales Fire and Rescue Service, addressing some of the sort of major concerns that we have at the moment with wildfires across the South Wales valleys in particular. But what we're looking to do within the project is to incorporate land management approaches to combating and reduction in the spread of wildfires, rather than actually just saying that we'll never have fires again, because we all know that fires are a big problem. They're not going to go away, but the way in which we manage the land to reduce the impact of these wildfires is increasingly important. So yes, today I'm going to sort of give you a bit of a brief overview of what we've been working with the fire service doing so far, but also how it could sort of incorporate into the works that you've been discussing today. So I'll start off basically, as you can see on the screen, this is a heat map of basically the fires that have happened to date in the South Wales valleys. Just ignore the wonderful town names, which are completely in the wrong places, but it essentially gives you the criteria of where it's happening across South Wales so far. Since 2000, there's been 75,000 wildfires in the South Wales area, just within the South Wales Fire and Rescue Service. And that is an increasingly bigger concern to the fire service as time moves on. Now, they're noticing that the number of fires are actually reducing, which we all presume would be a great thing. But actually what's happening, although we're having less fires, the extent of the fires is phenomenally growing. And the opportunity that we have to do today, as you see on the right-hand side of the screen there, we have these fires that are becoming increasingly nearby to communities, causing risk to life and to properties and to businesses. And there's a multitude of other concerns that grow with these wildfires as they come about. So essentially, they've addressed some of these sort of issues as a really high concern in producing this higher risk facility. So we're looking at a combination of things that are very much addressing on open common lands. This could be on farming land, this could be on any sort of land managers across the board in Wales, really. There is a dedicated sort of reduction in the education in how we are looking at our swathes of monoculture vegetation, how fire can travel through that monoculture. There's a lack of education in that sense. There's limited long-term planning, especially within areas that are particularly in sort of large swathes of monoculture, might have experienced wildfires before, so now have become predominantly bracken-led and have an increased fuel amount in that sense. We're also seeing limited stock rotations, especially within the South Wales valleys, and I am speaking from a South Wales valleys perspective at the moment. The stock rotations on sort of areas where there's a predominance of bracken means that, you know, there's just continuing to extend out. This monoculture vegetation falls in with that as well. And also within the South Wales valleys, as we all know, the higher risk of antisocial behaviour that has become increasingly developing across the years, and we can see it happen across most of our commons. I am a common grazer myself and have that issue to hand, which we hopefully want to address as well within the project. So, as sort of John and everyone has mentioned, is this changing climatic conditions, which is the highest fire risk. We're having increasingly longer growing seasons, which means that what we would have seen in the past, where sort of in the later part of the winter into autumn, we would have had the fire seasons. Now that it's extending out, we're seeing more fires in the summer with drier summers, and the vegetation dying off, and the higher fuel amount is all participating into this high fire risk, which we're seeing much of. Now, what's quite interesting, the firefighters that I've been working with through this project are the wildfire experts for the UK, and they've shown increasingly working with European counterparts, showing that the UK is currently in a situation where Portugal was 20 years ago. Now, Portugal, as we've all seen in the very recent times, as well as other sort of Mediterranean countries, are experiencing massive wildfires. And they were exactly the same place that we are now. The only difference being is that we don't have the hot summers. But with climate change, the climatic conditions coming in, we're having an increasing rate. It's double the chance of having a hot summer like we did in 2018. There's a higher fire risk in that sense. And so there's an increasing concern, both to sort of our nature, our biodiversity, our open common lands, our grazing, and the list goes on really. So here are some examples of some of the work that could be done as part of sort of land management practices. We have this sort of mosaic which allows for green grass to continue to grow. Now, slightly controversially, if you continue to have people walking across that ground, it allows for that grass to be kept down, it allows for the areas to be kept wider. There's a bigger fire risk in that picture there, which allows for a better fire risk management. Also opening out on the bottom right there, you can see we've been doing some work with robotic mobile cutters that can access high steep ground to open out public pathways, which will inherently become fire breaks in the future. As well as using horses in the top right there, which is, you know, again, looking at bracken brashing and management and cutting, and a regime of options which will allow for better management as time goes on. So this is again where we are at the moment. So the Healthy Hillsides project, as I mentioned, is a land management approach. It's bringing together multi-agencies to work together in a common goal. The fire service always mention, and it is quite apt, we are all working towards the same goal, but we're working in our own silos. It's almost as if we're a shipping container and we're all working in our own little containers. We've all going to the same place, but we've all got a different agenda. But if we work together in a multi-agency approach towards a set goal, we're actually become a container which is full of sand. We're all working together, we're all doing the same thing, and we're all working to that goal, and we're going to get there, and it'll be a better approach at the end, rather than working all together and not doing as much as we possibly could. So our sort of framework in its sense is a mixture of education, response, and prevention, which is pretty much how we interconnect our public goods. It's bringing together the vulnerability that everyone has towards wildfire. We're all in the same position when it comes to that, be that on common land, be that in forestry or in open farmland. We need to play together in order to bring together the right land management practices, have a toolbox of varied tools that can include a sustainable opportunity, looking at payment schemes, looking at opportunities to better the amount of grazing that's available, or and addressing nature's emergency, addressing the climate emergency. It's that one sort of opportunity, bringing together a multitude of aspects that can work together and bring an opportunity for collaborative working. Now, in this, we have in the sort of centre circle, you can see that we have this collaboration of education, which is all about community awareness. It's bringing together young people in education, but it's also about training, and that's training of farmers, land managers, and understanding that fuel management. The fire service always say that they're not firefighters any longer, they're fire managers. It's reached to the point where the fires can get so big that there's nothing much they can do. They just have to prepare and develop opportunities in which the land is managed better for the future. There's not enough firefighters on the ground for the size of the few of fires that we could potentially have in the future. Policy change is a massive opportunity here. So working together with likes of us as NRW, we've got the Wildlife Trust on hand, there's 15 other partners in this project, and we are working into this multi-agency approach to develop a strategic plan for the future. That's long-term planning, that is bringing together the community, understanding that awareness, looking at where a multitude of other benefits could come from that as well. So improving health, improving the biodiversity, improving the climate change adaptation to the site, or its economical benefits. It's this multitude approach which can really focus people's objectives and bring together. Now, this approach is not just for fire. Anything you can put into this framework here on your common land in any sort of structural approach would allow for you to better and develop your opportunities moving forward. So in its essence, really, we really sort of advocate that the fire risk mapping as an element of this common land approach and management is essential. Common land is an increasing concern in the fire service with the developments of monoculture, as well as how people are interacting with their with the environment as well. So it could bring in that antisocial behaviour element into it. So it's something to consider in a safe and sustainable future. We need to address the monocultural developments that are happening across undergrazed areas in particular, as well as areas that are in high risk of fire areas. The fire service understand this trends, they look at trends, they understand where those high areas are, and are available in order to give that expert approach for fire management rather than fire response. So in that essence, I just wanted to leave it at that and just to give a brief overview of where we are. I'm more than happy to share all the objectives of the Healthy Hillsides project should anyone be interested in learning any more. This is looking at opportunities across 7 demonstration sites across the South Wales valleys for proactive land management for the reduction of fuel risk. And we are here to feed into policy and development as time goes on for improving our fire safety, not just within NRW, but for all land managers across Wales. And I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you very much. So following on from that then, you've got a very clear outcome that you want to achieve in terms of reducing numbers of fires, reducing severity of fires, reducing fire load. How do you think that now feeds into the approach that Gwyn has outlined? I can see myself that working with a more engaged and vibrant scene in terms of the grazers on the common is going to be very valuable to you. That's one of the things that we want to achieve with the means of this project, and taking into account what John was saying about what is it you're trying to achieve on the hillside, as it were. A few thoughts maybe in relation to how it plays into what Gwyn presented earlier.
Absolutely. So I think it falls hand in hand, to be quite honest, because inevitably a shorter grazed grassland in that sense, so, you know, a very good, well managed grassy areas with fire breaks that could be cut in and managed through continuous grazing is actually a long-term beneficial goal for fire risk management. Cutting in these fire breaks, they need to be managed longer term. There's no point sending in a machine every time if grazing would be an opportunity there. So on one of our demonstration sites in particular, we're looking at geofencing, which is basically a collar-led cattle grazing demonstration, in which case we're proactively looking at creating those fire breaks and then having the cattle go in and manage that site afterwards, and really focus their grazing to keep the grass level down, and also to keep the sort of bracken from impeding on back into those grazing areas. So there is a sort of a hand-in-hand approach here. The main goal may not be for fire risk management. There might be a site that had never had a fire and they never really experienced it before, but there is always a potential, and the increasing potential that is on our hands at the moment, especially with the climate change risk assessment that's just been updated in the sense that fire has been addressed 21 times and needs to be addressed immediately across all of Wales, is something that needs to be considered. And now we are feeding into local development plans, for example, in terms of fire risk management. So that wasn't done before. That's a proactive step in addressing that we're all facing the same issue. We're all working towards that end goal that, you know, there is going to be a change. We need to work towards a climate change adaptation and then go from there, really. So in the sense of the scorecards, I think it's integral. I think that, you know, it feeds in with that opportunity for creating a more sustainable common land, a better land for grazing, a better land for nature. It's a better land for the future. It's better land for communities. And these fire breaks are also, you know, have a hand in mental health and well-being. It's creating more opportunities for people to access that land as well and to focus them there. There's a lot of benefits in that, and it doesn't need to be a set goal. It needs to be a part of the whole thing, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Gwen, if you'd like to come back on that at all, or are you?
I think time is running away with us, yeah. But I think the way I see it, what the fire rescue services are doing and what we're doing is coming at the same thing from the two different directions, isn't it, really? That we can see the value of these complementary actions and management planning, and if they can see the value of area payments and encouraging the graziers to do appropriate management, then that's to the good. What's not very clear to me and what's worrying to me, I think, really, is how this, is being joined up in government, whether it's being joined up in government. And then, of course, there's a third pillar, which is the elephant in the room, really, which is law enforcement, isn't it? How law enforcement also gets actively involved, whether it's arson, whether it's speeding on Fairwood or whatever.
Yeah.
The three things are quite disjointed now, really. And if SM&R and well-being and all these things are to mean anything, then they should all be working together, shouldn't they?
Absolutely. Yes.
Okay. Do you already have? We need to move on to the last contributor now. So he's a almost neighbour of mine. So Arfon Williams, RSPB Agriculture Policy Officer. So Arfon and myself going to have a little chat before we finish. So Arfon, do you want to? Where do you want to start? Do you want to start with the general, or do you want to start with the particular? I mean, where do you see this fitting into the wider policy picture just now, from RSPB's perspective?
Diolch, Gwyn. I'll start with an overview of what I've heard, I think, or perhaps I'll just qualify that by, why has Gwyn asked me to kind of speak today? So I am Gwyn's neighbour. We do occasionally share the odd cup of tea in Barrabrith and have a chat about kind of farming and the countryside. I lead on RSPB Cymru's kind of land use policy, so very, very, very much focused on what follows the CAP in Wales. and perhaps as relevant, perhaps more so, I was kind of a tier gofal officer and a Glassdeer project officer for the best part of 10 or 12 years. So kind of first-hand experience of working with farmers on the ground. And that's where I'd like to start, I think, with this. I think in all of those years, I don't think I came across the level of enthusiasm for kind of scheme participation or a future scheme participation I've heard in the film and listening to the two graziers today. I think that speaks volumes about the work of this project to date, is that it's built a level of enthusiasm on the part of kind of farmers themselves to take part in something like this, which given the concerns that farmers have for, certainly Glassdeer, Tir Gofal beforehand was more popular. I think that's been a huge success in the project, is building that level of enthusiasm for kind of a trial or the next steps, really. I think, what I've heard today deserves kind of road testing a bit. I think there's a very neat approach here. And I think the concerns or the points that John Ratcliffe raised about, well, what's the objective? Well, I think that should be part of this kind of, this working together element of a project or a trial, because the objective is probably going to be different depending where you are in Wales, the commons you're looking at, the set of local circumstances that come that integrate, and one of those may be kind of fire risk, it might be biodiversity, it might be access, it might be all sorts of things. But I think working together to develop your vision of what good looks like is a key part of this. Then I think from that, working on the scorecard that would help farmers and others progress towards achieving that. So I think that there's an important kind of integration there, which I don't know whether that was part of this project, Gwyn, or whether the kind of scorecard came based on, well, we know what we want to do in these areas, therefore we develop a scorecard to move towards that. I think the point that John made is, well, perhaps there needs to be a step before that, is well, let's all sit around the table together. It'll have to be a very big table, I think, but agree on what it is that we're trying to achieve, and then you develop a scorecard, and then work in that sort of in that collegiate way in order to kind of help progress management along the lines we've already discussed. So I think that was in a nutshell. I think that's what I'd like to say. I think this sounds really interesting. It is interesting. It's got that kind of broad habitat approach, which then bears down on the detail. The scorecard, I think the conversations touch on the kind of the current condition and the reasons for that condition, and also what might be required to move towards whatever good looks like. And I think those types of conversations, the understanding that those conversations have led to within the kind of the farming community themselves is evident in the conversations we've heard today, and also on the video we heard as well. And I think the fact that there's that level of enthusiasm there and an appetite to do something with this is a real kind of, I think that's a real positive. That's a huge achievement of this project, given the time that you've been working here. So that's the long short version, but that was my take of what I've heard today.
Oh, that's fine. I'm glad you're so positive. It's covered most of the ground I was going to cover anyway. But one question, just I'd be interested in your response. A lot of RSPB's work in the past has been very detailed. I mean, I used to work in the north of Scotland, where concrete measures were developed by RSPB very successfully and implemented very successfully, and they worked by a very strict set of rules, if we're really honest, which were necessary because of the quirks of the bird, etc. Do you think that'll be a challenge, whether for RSPB or for NRW or whoever, is to trust the mechanism enough, to relax the constraints a bit, and to allow the card to do the job, and to allow farmers to respond to the card? Or do you think there'll always be this fear that things might go wrong, or it'll be a waste of money, or what, all these other fears that people have?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think species corncrakes or curlew or lapwing, basically they require the right habitats, the right mix of habitats at the right sort of scale. So if it, provided, and I think this would be an interesting thing to test, provided it was possible to capture the information around, appropriate habitat condition within the scorecard and be able to kind of have some sort of progressive means of achieving, what good looks like, but in terms of habitat condition, then I think it's possible. I think that the key when you highlighted, the success around Corncrake, which has been repeated for things like Searle bunting down in the southwest and stone curlew on the Brecks, advice has been a big part of that. So it's as much about advice provision as it is about the information farmers are given. And I think it was interesting that the two farmers in the video highlighted the important role of advice, and certainly that support up front as well, because this is going to be new for a lot of people. So building that understanding early on and just establishing just how much advice and support will be necessary to deliver this. I think that's a key part of this as well. So if we're looking at, if this was kind of moving to a kind of test and trial stage, I think testing that, just where's that kind of just right spot for the advice, and and importantly, what type of advice works as well. Somebody said pictures and video clips, and it doesn't have to be all face to face. It can be the right advice presented in the right way at the right times as well. And increasingly, more and more people are they have a digital, they understand digital technology and able to access this information. So I think that could well be part of the solution as well.
Okay. Well, I think we have to draw it to an end, Arfon, because the time is going. We'll try. We're not going to finish quite within the 2 hours. But thanks very much for your contribution. Yeah, diolch yn fawr iawn I ti, Wyled, do.
Yeah. Panel te bara brief.
Yeah. And Clifton on Parade also, Arfon. Let's put it on record here. Okay, Hwyl. Okay, so before I hand back to Hamish for the final words, it's right, I think, at this point, because it's the final event really, even though the webinar is to come yet, of the project, to say a bit really, to thank various people and to address various things. So I think we should say really that the project has been a bit challenging. We've had to cope with COVID, which really did make it difficult for a very long time over the year. I'd like to thank my colleagues really for responding so well to it. Actually, one of the benefits of having part-time colleagues is that we can squash work into a smaller period. So some of them are out today, actually, scoring comments. So yeah, thanks very much to Helen and Catherine and Joe and Tony and Nigel and Karen in the office, looking after the money side. I think it's right to say, actually, that it's been quite difficult to get engagement with public stakeholders for a long period in the project. And that's quite a disappointment. And it especially is a disappointment when it's so difficult to get a clear vision anywhere in paper for large parts of the countryside, especially out with designated sites. So that's something that has got better as the project got on, and that's contributed to the success of the project such as it is, I think. The plans of Welsh Government are very opaque, really. It feels very much as if they need help, but we didn't feel that they were very good at asking for it. Sometimes when we had meetings with them, it was difficult to discern whether they were just being secretive or whether they were short of ideas, Too often, I think there was hiding behind the next policy announcement, even though the policy announcement didn't contain anything which moved the thing forward as far as Commons were concerned. And so it's really easy, I think, to have a cup half full view with regard to the policy changes. But I think it's equally possible to have a cup half empty. But it's equally possible, I think, to have a cup half full view, because West Government is saying that commons are important, and it is saying that it needs to put them at the centre of its thinking. And it is saying that it wants ideas from stakeholders. So now is the time, really. I mean, we're not lobbyists. The project isn't a lobbying project. We're just trying to interpret West Government's own objectives and suggest ways that they can be implemented more effectively, more cost effectively, and more efficiently, and in a way that achieves what West Government wants, not just for the environment, but also for farming businesses and their empowerment. So we don't think there's anything to lose from trialing and further developing approach, really. We think if it works for policy and for administrators and for graziers, then it's a win-win for government, actually, rather than the project. And if it doesn't succeed, then what's the harm of having tried it? And then finally, I need to end with some thanks. So I talked about the team earlier on. We need to thank the funders. We're always just lumping the leader groups together, but I think it's appropriate to name them. So Swansea, Neath Talbot, Rural Action Cwm Taf, Cwm Mynydd, Create Torfaen, and Arwen Powys. They're the 6 leader groups that funded this, and then NRW with co-funding. And then finally, we need to thank some individuals, I think, who, through believing in us at the various points of the project, allowed it to be born and allowed it to carry on at really difficult times. So before there was this project, there was a conference in Bernafon, and a group of glaziers and others from that area went over to the Burren. And of course, many people were also involved in that. But I think the person who lit the fuse really at the very start was Alvin Nicholas in Torfaen Council. So I really want to thank him. Yeah, he was instrumental really right at that initial part of it. And secondly, I think leader isn't always the easiest of things, and there's certain traditions grown up around leader, what kind of things get funded. So I think it took a bit of guts on the part of the lags to be willing to fund us, to be honest, and the leader project officers to encourage that. And again, somebody had to start the process, and the person in that case was Helen Gray, who at that time was in Swansea Council, now with NRW. So I'd like to thank Helen. And then finally, some people have been instrumental to start, some, stepped up later, but some have been there throughout, actually, and head and shoulders above them has been tonight's chairman, Hamish Osborne. So whether there's an advocate for more engagement within NRW, or an enthusiastic supporter as chair of the LAG in Swansea, he's always been a rock of the project, really, and a catalyst. So I don't think it's fair that he wasn't be a blind advocate of the thing, but I think he always thought that there was a chance to be taken here, a thing to be investigated that was worth doing, really. And so with that huge thanks, I hand back to Hamish. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Gwyn. And I'll keep this brief because I know we're overrunning. I worked overseas in a lot of projects to do with environmental management, catchment management, and we always adopted, or tend to adopt, a farmer first approach. And I think that is one of the key essences to this project, is that we are trying to develop a shared understanding of what good looks like. We know how important commons are. They're important to so many different people for so many different reasons. Developing that shared understanding, being able to articulate it and build a system based on that shared understanding has been a challenge. And I think this project has been very, very interesting, really successful. I've been involved in quite a lot of projects as a leader, quite a lot of grant funding through NRW, and I have to say that the pace and the energy with which the team led by Gwyn have put this together has been really impressive, particularly given some of the stumbling blocks along the way, not least of all a pandemic, dealing with some of the what I unkindly call bureaucracy of the organisations. It's there for good reason, but it's not easy to deal with. So really, really well done. Thank you for that. I think we've had a good, honest discussion today. Obviously, we could have gone on for a lot longer. Some really important questions being raised. And the way to answer those questions, I think, is to take us on to the next stage, and that is to trial it. I'm not sure of any other show in town. I'm not sure that anyone else has got any better idea. We know how important the commons are. We've got to find a way forward with all the change that is upon us. And I think trialing this is obviously the best thing to do the next stage. The product's there, it's well developed, it's got a whole lot of research and basis to it. So I think we really need to do that. So I don't know what's going to happen next, Gwyn, where you guys have a well-deserved rest, but I think we're going to have to work out a way of taking us on to the next stage, talking to the people who might help us make that happen. So we're over time. I'm going to leave it there. Just to say once again, thank you to everyone involved. Thank you everyone for coming to the meeting today. It will be available to share with your friends and people I know will be interested in it and who can pick up on where the project's got to. And of course, there's one more webinar and a final report will be produced. And I'm sure that Gwyn and the team will be around to have a chat, answer any questions if people want to come back. And let's make sure that we can get this taken seriously and put forward for a trial. So if anyone's got any influence or strings they can pull on that, please do so. So thank you very much. And well done. Good event. Thank you, Gwyn. Bye-bye.